Hey everyone, before we jump into today's episode, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor of the show, Procurify. If you've enjoyed the content we put out here, a great way to say thank you, after obviously giving us a 5-star review and sharing with your friends, is checking out Procurify. Procurify is the procure to pay platform for charter schools. Basically, that means they help your school manage all the various manual aspects of the purchasing process in one platform. You can learn more at byq.org/procurify. That's PROCURIFY. All right, now back to the show.
Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
All right, Julie Anne, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn from you today because I know nothing about moving schools. And before we dive in, could you give us a quick rundown on you and your role at Public Prep for those who don't know you?
Absolutely. So I've been in education operations in New York City for the last, I would say, 13, 14 years. But my current role is the Network Director of Operations and School Support at Public Prep, which is a charter school in New York City. So I run operations and compliance for our network across all departments, including academic and talent. But what I really love about my job the most is that every day is a different day. So one day I can be working with operations teams, looking at SIS systems, how to use it effectively. Another day is running PD days. Another day is submitting compliance or even moving schools. But my ultimate goal is to try to make things moving and keep driving our work in the right direction.
I love it. Yeah, never a dull moment in operations. So, we're going to be talking about moving entire schools and all of the fun things that go into taking students out of one building, preparing another building, and making that move actually happen. But I want to set some context and maybe give you some street cred for making this happen. So, I've gotten some of the background on some of the moves you've had to navigate, but could you walk listeners through really like the last 24 to, or I guess 18 to 24 months and the three different moves or components of moves that you all have navigated at Public Prep?
Absolutely. So, in order to set the scene, I'm going to take us back to fall 2022. I think most of your audience members know this, but at that point in time, most charter schools and schools were returning to their pre-pandemic schedule if they hadn't already, so that they were asking students to show up 5 days a week, 100% in-person attendance. And so when we saw that, and then we quickly realized that a lot of families during the pandemic had relocated, moved, what have you, we realized that our enrollment numbers were declining because parents were faced with the choice of either remaining in our system and attending in person or withdrawing. And so because we kind of had a glimpse into our enrollment crisis that I know a lot of schools are facing, we quickly realized that it was impacting all of our schools, but the one school that it was impacting the most was the Lower East Side for a variety of reasons. One, just the market wasn't there. For those of you who know the Lower East Side, the demographic has completely changed from 20 years ago. There was just definitely more of a need in other areas where charter schools aren't as saturated, like the North Bronx, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so to preserve our financial health and just make a long-term enrollment strategy that just benefited our organization as a whole, our senior leadership team decided to close down our Lower East Side charter school over the span of 2 years. I think we were lucky enough in hindsight to be able to crunch some numbers and understand that we had the luxury of 2 years. I think sometimes schools don't even have that opportunity. But that was in, I would say, fall 2022, January 2023, that decision was made. And so that was one of the first moves that was made. And so then simultaneously, we also decided to build a brand new girls' private facility in the Northern Bronx. We already had a boys' private facility. And so again, we wanted to make a girls' private facility to give our girls a beautiful private space. There was a lot of strategic factors that went into deciding this location. Like I mentioned, one, the demand for charter schools is pretty high in the Northern Bronx. So we knew, though, that the building would likely not be ready until the 24-25 year. So in the 22-23 year, we were working to make sure that our girls' school, which was currently living in our boys' private facility, had its own temporary space to continue to grow, to recruit students. And one of the other strategic factors in this temporary space was that while they were living in District 8, we found a temporary space in District 10, which was where the new private facility would eventually be. So we could start to recruit those families that were in the neighborhood. So To recap,
Yeah, give us the quick recap.
this is the part recap. So
Yep.
this is the first summer. We closed down our elementary campus for Lower East Side and just moved that to the middle school. And then we moved the Girls Prep Bronx to a temporary DOE facility. Summer 2024, I like to call that the sequel almost to these moves. So where we officially closed down the Lower East Side, we moved our Girls Prep Bronx 2 school into their new private facility. And then the third component that kind of came up at the last minute was we moved our middle school also into the new private facility. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, later why we did that, but that was the third final component of the move.
Okay, so for those that were tracking with us here, we've got basically three different distinct moves. We've got closure of school, temporary space, combining schools, and a lot of this happens behind the scenes. I think particularly, as parents, you just kind of expect the school that you're sending your kids to be there and the building's ready for day one, and you don't always think about all the logistics that are going on behind the scenes. And so I think most operations teams have probably had to navigate maybe a single move or maybe opening a new campus. But navigating that many moving parts at once is a huge logistical challenge. And so I want to dive into some of the behind the scenes and some of the weeds and learnings that you had along the way. And so maybe it would be good to go back to fall 2022, sort of where you started the move saga. When did you and the ops team know that all these facilities changes were coming? Like, was this all kind of mapped out? Or, talk us through a little bit about when you knew this was the plan.
So the plan was somewhat already in motion prior to me joining public prep, but my supervisor at the time and also a key member of this planning process and our COO, Jean Marie Hendershot, she actually told me either during my interview or day one of me being
You sure you want to take this job, Julie Anne? Yeah.
Just to be clear, before you sign your contract.
Right.
So I was very transparent. But when it came to communicating with ops teams, I think we were always really intentional about when we wanted to bring them on. We, of course, knew that they were integral in the process, but we also really wanted them to focus on the day-to-day, right? The school still has to run. Things still need to happen. So it was kind of a series of just letting the director of operations know, including the principal, and then letting ops teams. And pretty much prior to the summer, that May, June time period before the moves happened, they were pretty much involved. But again, it was kind of a slow buildup just because, again, if you say you're moving your campus, I would imagine anyone, even the most experienced operations leader, is going to be like, wait, what? That's, so
Right.
being mindful that they also had to run a school in addition to moving. So.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense. Not overwhelming everyone all at once.
Exactly.
So then what did it look like to develop a plan once you heard this needed to happen? Obviously, it sounds like it was an iterative process in looping in other teams, but kind of like where do you start basically
Yeah.
in planning for this many relocations?
That's a great question. So I think one of the things that, my supervisor, Jean Marie, sort of ingrained in me was just being flexible. It's a really big balance, and I'll probably mention this a few other times, of planning until you can't plan anymore. So it's like that phrase, stay ready. So if you stay ready and when you
Yeah.
get information, you can plug and play, but also just being flexible. Flexibility is the name of the game. Sometimes you have information right out of the gate, and other times you don't until 2 months prior to moving. And so just it was definitely an art of balance and just navigating those two components. In terms of like the concrete planning, I don't think we intended to do this, but I think this is what I would recommend to other people. We treated each summer separately.
Okay.
There were, of course, things that we considered over the 2-year period. So an example of that is when we closed the elementary school of the Lower East Side and moved them to the middle school campus. The question was, what do we do with the elementary school furniture? A lot of our elementary campuses had more than enough furniture. And when you're thinking about like being cost effective, especially with movers, it doesn't really make the most sense to pay movers to bring elementary furniture to only have to have the same issue a year later when you're closing the school and figuring out what to do with that. So there were definitely things that we thought about over the 2 years plan, but for the most part, because different people were involved in each of the summers, it was a lot of just how do we get these objects from point A to point B and make sure school is still set up in time for school launch.
Okay, so you alluded that there were a lot of different people involved, and it sounds like this was a mix of, thoughtful strategic planning with also the agility needed for short-term adjustments for each summer. Who all was involved in that process? Like, talk us through. I would imagine there's probably internal and external stakeholders, even just, you're a good example of the furniture. that's movers and contractors. And just talk us through kind of who all was involved in this process as you all are ramping up, getting ready for maybe that first phase.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with external. I'm sure this is very similar to any other large city, but there is just a ton of people who are involved in New York City. I think with any type of change with schools, one, because New York City is such a vast school system. And two, as I've come to learn just through my experience, there are different departments for different things. So there's Department of Health, Department for Nursing, Department for Transportation, but then there's different people for Manhattan, Bronx, Queens, Staten Island. And then when you get into that, find that actual person, then there's a district leader and, so on and so forth. So it's really of course, you have to loop in their supervisors, but finding that right person that pertains to your actual location. So I think we had a person for each of those departments for our own district, let alone, and then their supervisors. And then, of course, director of space planning. And then internally, again, my supervisor was like the liaison with the construction team and kind of helped to manage that and just making sure she worked with we had a fractional real estate team, worked with them to kind of make those decisions. Cause again, we wanted to make sure that we had that expert opinion and we're making the most cost effective, right decisions. Movers, we initially had movers put out a bid and we ended up working with the same movers for both of our summers, which actually worked out well since they were familiar with our locations and familiar with how we worked. And then our school-based staff, just making sure, we it takes a lot of people to pack a lot of school belongings. So principals, leaders, teachers, you name it, a lot of custodial work to make sure that they were aware of what was going on. Yeah, just the name of the game, communication across all platforms and all mediums.
Okay, love it. So let's get into some additional details on the planning front. Talk to us about maybe some of the more like tactical ops components here. So, as you all are, like you just mentioned, cross functional communication, critical, keeping track of all the moving parts, I would imagine extremely critical to document. Talk us through maybe like, did you use project planning tools? Did you develop a master schedule? And you can break this out however, it actually played out across the different summers. But I'm sure people are curious, okay, functionally, what did you actually do? Is this like the world's greatest Google sheet or Excel sheet? Or, do you have every team has their own, project deliverables and you have one giant meeting, every couple weeks? Maybe you could flesh that out for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely had a project plan. I think we had an internal and then an external one. Asana is our network's project management tool. So we had Asana, but then we had Google Sheets for when we had to work with folks who did not have an Asana subscription. But moving specific tools, so I would say the project plan was really good for a lot of the things that you do leading up to the physical move, contacting
Okay.
the Department of Health, contacting closing accounts, etc. But then we had, I would say, some move specific tools. So we had inventory trackers that we literally would have like, these are the items in room 511 at this location. This is what they look like, and this is exactly where they're going to go. That was both helpful for us and the movers. We had a labeling system. I actually, by luck, happened to find these stickers on Etsy that were customizable and they were color coded. One thing I learned throughout this process is that movers, shockingly, don't know charter school acronyms. So you can't, you can't
You
say
don't say.
yeah,
Yeah.
so you have to put the address on there. So you got to speak in their language. So the labels had color coded address, and then you write the room, that number that's going. So that reflected the inventory tracker. We also created maps. So again, movers cost a lot. So we put the map on the door of the point B, the destination. And so that would tell the movers exactly how to set up the classroom. So, they're not just like throwing the desks and chairs, like the teacher's desk goes here, the chairs go here, the bookshelf goes there, etc. And we even got as far as we even created a video to show teachers how to pack, because that's actually a common mistake. Yeah, they kind of try to,
Really?
yeah, they tend
Okay.
to like just pack it all in. They want to just, because I think people are aware, we may not have enough boxes, we may not have enough tape. And what the problem is, though, is even though the movers are professionally trained to move it, it's a cardboard box. It's heavy. It's going to break. And the movers, honestly, the company on-site movers, for anyone who, shout out to them, they did a great job of communicating when a box was packed too heavy, because they also don't want to be blamed for, the box breaking or items breaking.
Right,
So we
right.
tried to do a lot of that proactively so we wouldn't run into that issue.
Got it. So this is like you wearing a GoPro, packing a classroom. and then sharing that with all the teachers.
Exactly. And literally me going to staff meetings and being like, I know this is going to sound crazy, but we're going to talk about how to pack a
Yeah,
box.
raise your hand. I know we're in New York City. Raise your hand if you've ever changed departments.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just putting it out there. So
Okay, I love it though. This is the fascinating kind of in the weeds stuff that I think
yeah.
people find interesting. So, you have the plan in place. You're mapping out the project across Asana, Google Sheets. You've got your labeling system from Etsy. Talk to us about the communication side with the rest of the org. What did that look like?
So we had regular meetings, again, kind of going back to the division of labor I was speaking about before. My supervisor kind of owned the regular meetings with construction and the senior leadership team. I would own the communication with the movers and school-based teams. And then we would, collaborate and make sure everyone had all the same information. I'm going to kind of make this a two-part answer and say this was a lesson that we learned eventually.
Okay.
While I would say for summer 2023, we really kept our meetings and communication to what we deemed were like operationally key stakeholders. I think it's important to be mindful of our instructional friends. I don't think they should need to get into the weeds. They already have enough on their plates in terms of making sure instruction happens, teachers are trained, etc. But for leaders who really care about the school, it can seem scary. And I think just information is key. Again, like they don't want to know, like how much the Etsy labels cost or where you're ordering cardboard boxes. They don't care. I think they just want to know that a plan is in place. So for summer 2024, we were really intentional about making I would say more committee meetings and just kind of being mindful, like those meetings were just to kind of share progress updates and information and let those folks ask questions to kind of give them a little bit of ease of mind or peace of mind. Even like our, for opening the new private facility, we looped in our development team because that's the big, like kind of
Right,
our
right.
piece. And I think that just kind of made everyone have the right mindset going into it, being open and flexible and just knowing that it's not a perfect playbook. Again, the name of the game is flexibility.
I think the recommendation of being thoughtful about transparency, but also figuring out what people actually want to know is a really strong learning. Just on since we were talking about planning and kind of project planning and building stakeholder alignment, are there any other specific lessons? I guess maybe now that you're reflecting back just on that first or on the various, planning phases, any other specific lessons or learnings for other ops teams that might be listening to this right now who are about to embark on a move of their own?
Yeah, I think kind of similar to what I was just saying. I think it's just sort of like those key stakeholders want to know things. Never assume that someone knows even what's happening, even an ops team member. They might be the most well versed ops coordinator, but if it's their first time moving, there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of questions. And even like though it may seem like common sense, it's really worth your time to just be like, hey, do we need to sit down and talk about this? I end up doing this a lot with ops team members who are packing and who are really at the core of the work. And I think it's just creating that safe space for like, there's no judgment here. This is a crazy endeavor. We're in this together. And I think that just makes them feel more comfortable and feel more confident in their work.
Right. Goes a long way.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get into some of the other components of this multi year 3-part move. So I want to talk about two of the separate moves you talked about. One was shutting down your Lower East Side campus, and then the other being moving a group of students into a temp space, because I think both require different sets of planning. So, talk to us a little bit about shutting down a school and what's involved in shutting down a campus. As the untrained observer, I just always think this happens when school's out and nobody's there and you just, cram it all into 1 month and then move everything. Is that what actually happens? And then talk us through some of the recommendations or things that ops teams can be doing in preparation to actually close down a building.
Yeah, I hate to disappoint you, but actually it does start before before summer gets out. It's a pretty starts yeah, I know. I think what I would just really stress for any network or campus that is considering closing a school, I think one of the things our network and our senior leadership team did well for this particular closure was communicate as far as advanced as possible. Again, Girls Prep Lower East Side was our flagship school. There was a very strong community there. And I think not only giving parents enough time to just process and teachers as well and to understand why that decision was being made, but then to also plan. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but like gives our girls a chance to maybe go to another one of our schools and just understand what it means to find another home for their scholar. So I think that was really great. In terms of like the business side of it, there's a lot of just little things that you want to do ahead before the physicality. And so there's, again, a lot of things, period, when it comes to a move. But the way I think my brain worked and a lot of other people's brains worked in this is that because you can't move the things and pack the things until May or June, you want
Right.
to do as much as you can before in February, March, April leading up to it. And so that looks like communicating with the DOE, again, not to, sound like a broken record, but there's a million departments and a million people that you have to let know that you're moving and why you're moving, et cetera. Closing accounts financially, making sure that, we're good there. You don't want to be doing that while you're moving. In the case of Lower East Side, you have to keep the student files. So we made the decision to like scan and upload all of our student files in case parents needed it, which of course they did. And so just doing all these things ahead of time kind of puts your brain at ease so you could just focus on physically removing that. The other thing I will say, though, for Lower East Side specifically, is that was a co-located building. And so we worked with the co-located school in the beginning just to kind of do a floor plan, walk around. We were able to donate some furniture to them after looking at our enrollment numbers and decided that we had some extra furniture to give them, deciding like how we were going to move so they could start to move in. It's not a requirement, but it's a courtesy thing, I would say.
Gotcha. Can you quickly explain co-location for those who've never spent time in New York City?
Yes.
Not as common elsewhere.
Not as common. My pleasure. For those of you who don't know, space is coveted in New York City. There is school upon school upon school. And so what will often happen is that they're both in public schools and with charter and public schools, just to find space. You'll often find that there can be 2 to 3 schools in a building. Then that's just the way the building is set up, and that's usually determined by enrollment. So if a school doesn't have as significant of an enrollment, maybe it's a middle school and they only have 200 students, but the building is designed for 500 students. The New York City, as long as there is an existing charter in the case of charter schools or, a building permit, they will make it work so that 2 schools can exist in the same physical location.
Okay, thank you. Super
Yeah.
helpful explanation. All right, so let's get to the temp space. And, I think a lot of schools that are freshly founded maybe start in a temp space, see all sorts of things between sharing space with a YMCA or a local church or community center. But it's a different challenge when you have an established school and then you need to go find a space to keep running that school, from a continuity perspective. So, can you just talk to us a little bit about like, did you have a temporary space already teed up before you knew or before you made the announcement of the relocation? What did that look like? What type of space was it? Some of those questions.
Yeah. So this is actually a pretty interesting story. So prior to me joining public prep, I think the senior leadership team knew that a temporary space would just be needed. Just, in the case that the construction ran late, et cetera, we want to continue to grow our enrollment. So there was a lease agreement that was put out with 200 West Tremont, in case anyone wants to look it up. But what was really just a crazy turn of events was that the people we were contracting for real estate expertise, they had done a walkthrough of the building and they had called our CEO at the time. And they say, you just need to trust us. We've done this several times. Do not sign this lease agreement. Do not sign this lease agreement. Sure enough, the next day, it was on the news that bricks were falling off the side of the building.
No. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
Yeah. And so we did not sign that lease agreement. But the point of that is it put us in a position where we needed to find a temporary space.
Right.
So we, again, shout out to my supervisor, Jane Marie. She continued to just put out calls for help with all of our friends at the DOE from all the different departments, just asking to see if anyone had just a 1-year temporary lease agreement. Shout out to her for just being persistent and resilient and just keep putting it out there. We knew about a space, but we did not get the official confirmation that space was ours until May 2023. So 2 months before we were set to move out, which is kind of crazy. But again, it kind of goes back to the theme of just being flexible, staying ready, and making sure that you have a plan. And so literally, because even though we were all, of course, naturally very nervous and you're like, oh my gosh, do we have a space? I had the plans and it was just really a matter of literally plugging and playing the room numbers. I may or may not have just pulled up to the school and asked the custodian for pictures of the floor plan, but
You got to do what you got to do.
you got to do. But because we had talked through a lot of the just logistics, even from a skeleton 500-foot level, it was a little bit easier to kind of pivot and make it happen. So yeah, relentless persistence is key. Especially when working with, I'm sure, other cities as well, but definitely the New York City Department of Education.
Yeah, totally. So, in the midst of, I guess, maybe a specific question, as you're prepping everything for that temp space, how do you decide this is worth doing versus this is not worth doing in creating the experience of the temp space for your scholars? Because I would imagine if you know it's just going to be a year, or even if you knew it was going to be 2 years, it's less motivating to kind of build everything out and have all the bells and whistles of the classroom experience or the facility experience. How did you all decide that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know fully what, like, if we didn't get it, if, like, I'm sure we would have just stayed in the boys' private facility and made it work. But there was a couple of factors. One being we were really committed to growing this cohort or this school, especially knowing that it was going to be in a private facility and that would attract a lot of people. So when we moved to the temporary location, a lot of the messaging was like, this is temporary, but if please join us and know that your daughter will be attending this brand new state of the art private facility for 24-25. So that was very alluring to parents. Another key factor was that temporary location was in District 10, where our new private facility is now. So when you're talking about recruiting local families,
Right. You're kind of in the neighborhood.
you're in the neighborhood, getting to know the community. It also gave our leadership team just another year to kind of build those key relationships, right? Because you're already there. And then what kind of ended up working out, which we didn't know ahead of time, was that in terms of public transportation with busing, a lot of the students that had signed up for busing or whatever it may be for the 23-24 year at our temporary location, we were able to use those same stops for this year, and that helped retain a lot of our families. And so it was kind of like doing a little bit of that groundwork ahead of time. It was just kind of easy to communicate with the Office of Transportation and be like, hey, we know this stop is really popular. Can we continue to keep this and make sure it just is rerouted to the new private facility? So it was more of a strategic long-term decision, or how it will benefit the school long-term. But again, who knows, if we didn't get the temporary space, what would have happened?
Right. And painting that picture of here's where we're going, get the whole organization on board with families as well
Exactly.
to bring them along. Okay. So taking these two specific examples, shutting down a school and then also moving students into a temp space in prep for moving to a brand new location, I want to ask kind of two sides of the learning coin, I guess. Let's start with shutting down a school.
Yeah.
What would you do differently? That's question number one. And then question number two is, what would you encourage other ops leaders to do? So maybe like things you did well, brag on yourself a little bit, things that went well that you would encourage others to also take the time to do. So sort of either side of the coin on the school closure.
Yeah, I know folks, especially at Public Prep, are going to laugh at this one. But what we would do differently is donate the books. Donate the books. Do not pay the movers to bring books to another school. Unless, of course, if you need books at the new destination, please. Like, I do not want to sound like I am anti-learning, anti-reading.
Julie Anne hates reading. That's the title of this episode.
Forget reading, forget literacy. No. It's so funny how, especially you work in education, I remember vividly standing at the school the last day the movers were there. And of course, even though we had packed everything, we just found these extra boxes of books. And my guilty conscience was like, no, let's bring them. Let's bring them. I promise you, we have enough books to give away for the next, like, 10 back to school nights, parent conferences, whatever. Like, we're good on the book. So as silly as it sounds, I think I'm sure other items fall into that category where you feel, but more often than not, schools have enough books. Churches, communities, daycares, whatever, can benefit from it. And then it saves you the cost of having to pack the books, which are actually pretty heavy to pack,
Super heavy, right.
Yeah. But that is one thing I would do differently. And then one thing I guess we can brag about is that I think just creating a strong communication, but also coupled with just don't be afraid to reach out, ask the questions. I would say I consider myself to be pretty fearless. I'm more than happy to reach out to, hey, are you the right person for the Department of Health? If not, like, let me know. I think because we communicated the closure so far in advance, it created the runway or the space for people to ask questions, which then triggered any additional action steps that we missed. And then also myself and then my supervisor just kind of being bold and just reaching out to people and being like, what do we need to do? Like, we're new at this, like, just teach us. Then just kind of helped also trigger some additional action steps. And just, again, because we communicated this so far in advance, we had a little bit of a longer run rate to make any adjustments to the project plan or whatever the calendar and make sure we got everything done.
Perfect. So just to recap, donate the books, over communicate.
Yes. That's
All right.
it.
So I'm oversimplifying it, but same question then for moving to a temp location. What would you do differently? And then what went well that you would encourage others to double down on?
So I think specifically for this, I think we could have done a tighter job of managing expectations. So this school was in a situation where they were coming from our boys prep private facility. It is a well-oiled machine. We have a private facilities manager that is literally at their call if they need anything, if it's too cold, too hot. They also were cohabitating the space with another school. So you had another set of school leadership team members who you could always consult. Like, it's almost like a tag team. Like, hey, does this smell weird? Like, can you call them, et cetera. That's a really nice luxury to have, to go from that.
Right.
And again, to a DOE school. And it's like, if it can be very challenging to build relationships with those people because the custodian, the food service, the nurses, they don't work for you. They work for the DOE. And so I think most people know that it really is, there's an emphasis on building relationships in that. But I think we could have done a better job of previewing that with them and understanding that it is going to take a little TLC to get them to kind of get up to our expectations of how we run a school. But ultimately, with like collaboration and communication, we got to that place. And then to answer what we would encourage other ops leaders to do. I know I briefly mentioned this before, but just plan until you can't plan anymore. Plan, even just talking it through, making sure, even if you're like in our situation, we didn't know the temporary location until 2 months before, just saying, hey, this is a draft I have, but when we get that information, we're going to plug in the numbers, the room numbers, we're going to do all these things, and just making sure everyone feels very well informed. I think if you were to ask anyone from the team, it was mentally challenging at times, but I think just kind of really just walking through the plan multiple times, it gave them that peace of mind and reassurance that it was going to be okay.
Awesome. Love it. All right. So I'm going to bring us to a close here, and so many good learnings in the conversation, and really appreciate you sharing your experiences. For those who, found this conversation interesting, are an ops manager at a school that's moving and want to connect with you, Julie Anne, or want to learn more about public prep, where should we send them? Where should we link to in the show notes?
Yeah, they can find me on LinkedIn, Julie Anne Garretson, and they're more than welcome to check out Public Prep's website, publicprep.org, or visit our Instagram, also Public Prep.
Love it. Okay. And then I always like to ask this, but any just kind of like personal, professional development, any specific books, tools, resources, other podcasts that you find interesting or you found particularly helpful to you as an ops leader?
Charter School Insider only.
I need to start paying guests to say that. Yeah.
Well, I know, right? Ad books. I'm a big Radical Candor fan by Kim Scott. I also love Break All the Rules by Marcus Buckingham. And then for those of us who are just, even if you're kind of like me, where you're on the ground or behind the scenes, whatever, I personally think the Charter School Growth Fund has done a great job of sharing resources over the past few years. They do a great job of like taking other works from other schools and helping, so it saves you the ask of having to research another charter school. I know they email COOs. So if you have a good relationship with your COO or any operations leaders, feel free to be like, hey, do you get that resource email or that newsletter that has all the resources? I've used them time and time again, and I love it.
Amazing. Okay. Well, we'll link to all those. Shout out to the Growth Fund for the awesome email with resources. So perfect. Well, thank you again for coming on, Julie Anne. Really enjoyed the conversation, and it was a pleasure having you.
It was a pleasure being here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign-up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.